If I were to ask you the question, who was the first priest ever? I wonder how you would choose to answer that question. Maybe if I made a multiple choice, maybe we could come up with some kind of an answer to that question. But who was the very first priest? You see, last month we began talking about this biblical theme, the theme of the priesthood. And one of the things we noticed was that priests were everywhere in the ancient world. Every culture, every society, every city had its priests who served in the various temples of the different gods that those cities would worship or consider. These priests were everywhere. But one of the things we learn in the Bible is that Yahweh has his set of priests. Yahweh is not without priests of his own. And these priests of Yahweh are people who represent him, who speak on his behalf to the people and in turn represent the people to Yahweh. And they are those who care for Yahweh's space, who serve in Yahweh's home. But who was the very first priest? Who was the first person to ever fill that role for Yahweh? Our minds might automatically go to Aaron and his sons, who were named as priests over Israel and intervened between Yahweh and the people of Israel and served in the temple of Yahweh. If you dig a little bit deeper, you may remember, I think we mentioned this last month when we covered this topic, you may remember that Melchizedek was actually the first person in the Bible who has the designation priest. He's the first person who's called a priest of Yahweh, and that's hundreds of years before Aaron and his sons become priests. Was Melchizedek the first priest? To answer that question, I think we need to know a little bit of something about sacred spaces. And so I hope you'll indulge me for a minute as I talk about sacred space. Throughout the Bible, there are places where heaven and earth meet. There are stories, there are moments in the Bible where heaven and earth, in some place, for some moment of time, it's as if heaven and earth touch one another. These are sacred places. And these sacred places where heaven and earth meet are the stage for some of the Bible's most powerful stories. Stories where Yahweh interacts with humanity in personal and tangible ways. Can I give you some examples of sacred spaces where heaven and earth meet in the Bible? Probably the most well-known is the temple. The temple is a sacred space. It's the place where God interacts with Israel. And when you were an Israelite and you walked into that courtyard of the temple complex, when you walked into there, you were coming near the presence of God, because this was the place where the abode of God and the place of humanity met, even if just momentarily. It was where God lived among his people. Of course, when you went to the temple, if you were an ancient Israelite and you tried to go into the temple, you would know full well that an Israelite couldn't just waltz into God's presence. He couldn't just walk in without making sure that he was ready to meet God. And even then, there were certain stipulations about how close to God's presence he could get. The temple was sacred space, and the temple was guarded by priests who intervened, who made sure that those who came to God's presence to offer sacrifices or to be close to Yahweh were clean ceremonially, were clean from sin, were pure in every way imaginable according to the law of Moses. And so these priests guarded and served in the temple. And they would mediate between Israel and Yahweh. But the implication was certain in these stories about the temple. That was Yahweh's house. That was the place where Yahweh lived. Yahweh was here in the temple, tangibly sitting on his throne in the Holy of Holies. You may remember when Solomon prayed over the newly built temple. David wanted to build the temple, but David was not allowed by God to build the temple. Solomon built the temple based on all of the preparations and plans that David had established. And when Solomon was done building the temple, this is what the text says. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. The priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. All the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, "Truly, he is good. Truly, his loving kindness is everlasting." The presence of Yahweh was tangibly, visibly present in the temple. Why? Because it was sacred space. It was where, even if just for a moment, heaven and earth met. The presence of Yahweh wasn't fixed or bound there, however. It wasn't bound to this one location. There is and has been other sacred spaces throughout history and in the Bible. In fact, the temple was the permanent version of Yahweh's mobile home, his tabernacle. This was just, the temple was just the permanent version of the tabernacle that Israel wandered around with in the wilderness. But that tabernacle, too, was sacred space. Just like the temple after it, the tabernacle served as the place where Yahweh's presence was acknowledged among Israel. And just like in the temple, when Moses finished building it in Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 and 35, the text says that the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This wasn't just a representation of Yahweh's presence. This wasn't just like a cool thing that they built to remind them that they served Yahweh. This was actually, tangibly, a place where Yahweh's glory and presence was among his people. God said in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 11 and 12, "Moreover, I will make my dwelling among you." Some other translations might say, "I will make my tabernacle among you, and my soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God." And so this too was sacred space, served and guarded by those newly appointed priests, Aaron and his sons. But these aren't the only sacred spaces. Let me tell you about at least one more. Mount Sinai was a sacred space. We're kind of working backwards in history, by the way. Mount Sinai was a sacred space. Just like the tabernacle, just like the temple, Mount Sinai became an especially important place where God repeatedly throughout history made his presence known, where heaven and earth in certain moments of time touched. The first time is when Moses encountered God's presence in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. That was on Mount Sinai, where Moses saw on Mount Sinai this bush that was on fire, but it was not being consumed. And what the text says about that event in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2, the text says that in that event, in that moment, Yahweh appeared to Moses. God was there. Second, Moses and the Israelites encounter God's presence most memorably after the Exodus event when Moses received the law of God from Mount Sinai. This is what Exodus chapter 19 says about that. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. There's at least one more time that Mount Sinai becomes this sacred space where God interacts with the people of Israel. Years later, Elijah would flee for his life from Jezebel, and where he fled was none other than Mount Sinai. And there's this really memorable story there where God allows to pass before him all of these terrible sorts of events of nature, this earthquake, this fire, this great wind, this storm. And what ends up happening in most of our translations is Yahweh speaks to Elijah in a still small voice, or the New American Standard says the sound of a gentle blowing. That was Mount Sinai, where God spoke to Elijah. So Mount Sinai is a place where God interacts with humanity in a tangible way. But like in other sacred spaces, humanity isn't just allowed to scale the mountain. You're not allowed just to go waltz up to God's presence and go talk to God on top of the mountain. That's not allowed. In fact, especially in Exodus chapter 19, when the children of Israel are there at the foot of the mountain and Moses is preparing to get the law of God off of the mountain and bring it to the people, there's this whole scene set up where the people are to consecrate themselves, to prepare themselves, to even go to the foot of the mountain. They're to make themselves pure and holy. And God is especially sure to make sure they know in Exodus chapter 19, verse 11, the people of Israel must not touch the mountain because it is holy. It is my space. Eventually, God did allow Aaron and 7 of the elders of the people to come part way up the mountain, but only Moses was allowed to go before God's presence. By the way, that looks a lot like the temple, doesn't it? This 3-part division where the people are allowed into the courtyard, a select few are allowed into the holy place, but only one is allowed into the holiest of places where God's presence is. There are other instances of sacred places we could talk about. Mount Carmel is another sacred space where Yahweh defeated Baal in Elijah's contest. The city of Bethel is a sort of sacred space where Jacob's dream was of a vision of angels going up and down on the ladder. The altar of Abraham, where God made a covenant with him. There are places where God makes himself tangibly, physically present with his people. Sacred spaces are filled with God's presence. Sacred spaces are often terrifying to onlookers. People are horrified by the storm and the fire on Mount Sinai, for instance. Sacred spaces are often filled with fire and smoke. Sacred places are places of service and worship, and sacred places are meant to be protected and guarded because they are places where God is. The interesting thing about sacred spaces is they all start to sort of look alike. They all sort of have these 3-part divisions, progressively moving closer to the very presence of Yahweh, a location where God physically is. Why is that? Is that just a coincidence that the tabernacle and the temple have these 3-part divisions, and the Mount Sinai also has this 3-part division? Is this just a coincidence? I don't think so. You see, all sacred space is a model. All of these things, Mount Sinai, the tabernacle, the temple, they're all a model, a miniature representation of Yahweh's true dwelling place. They all point backwards like enormous flashing arrows to the very first story of the Bible, the Garden of Eden, which is truly, at least so far as creation is concerned, God's first sacred space. We don't often think about the Garden of Eden in this way. But there are some details in the description of the Garden of Eden that help us recognize that the Garden of Eden is the first sacred space where God makes his presence tangibly and physically known to humanity. First, the Garden of Eden is described as if it's on a mountain. Did you know that? The Garden of Eden is described as if it's on a mountain. And there's a detail in the story in Genesis chapter 2 where the Garden of Eden is described that seems to imply that. If you look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 10, there's these rivers that flow out of Eden and they water the whole land, but they flow outward from Eden. And that may be an inference that we're drawing, but I think it's a pretty good one since water always flows downhill. Eden must be at a high point. For 4 rivers to flow outward from it, Eden is at a high point. In fact, in Ezekiel chapter 28, Ty was such a good sport to read all of those hard stones names, all those reading. But if you caught in that reading, I don't know if you noticed it, but in that reading there was a description of Eden. It's actually a judgment declared against the king of Tyre. But in that reading in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 13 and 14, there is actually a description of Eden. And Eden is called in Ezekiel 28, the mountain of God. The Garden of Eden was on a mountain. This makes Eden look a lot like other sacred space, like Mount Sinai or Mount Carmel or the Temple Mount, Mount Zion. It reaches up, the garden does, to God's space, and God lives at the top. Second, the Garden of Eden is a place where God's presence is tangibly realized. If you've ever read that story about humanity in the Garden of Eden, God's presence is all throughout it. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, there's a description about God being in Eden, planting this garden, working with the ground to grow the trees. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, after man and woman had sinned against God, they'd rebelled against the instruction of God, it describes God walking through the garden. And the description is not as if this is some strange thing. This just seems to be what God does in the garden. Why? Because that's where his presence is. It's sacred space. This is the place where God lived among his creation. It's the place where he taught them. It's the place where he cared for them. It's the place where he rebuked them. Yahweh was there. Third, the Garden of Eden is part of a three-part structure moving closer and closer to God's presence. Genesis 1 is a description of the creation of the world, the cosmos, everything around us that we see. But when you start moving into Genesis chapter 2 and you see the way it's described in Genesis 2 verse 8, there's a description there of the creation of a garden and another place called Eden. By the way, I think when I was a kid, I had in my mind that the garden was called Eden. But that's not what the Bible says. Look at Genesis chapter 2 verse 8. The Lord God planted a garden toward the east in Eden. You see, there's the world that God created. Then there's this geographical location called Eden. And within that, God placed a garden. There's some questions that people have about exactly how to read those prepositions and where's the garden in relation to Eden. And I don't know that those questions are clearly answered for us in great detail. But here's what we do know. There is a description in Genesis 2:8 of the creation of a garden where man lives that is planted in or perhaps to the east of a place called Eden. And when man disobeys God, they defile themselves and they make themselves unfit to live in God's presence. And just as God would instruct somebody to be cast off the mountain who was unclean or cast out of the tabernacle or the temple who was unclean, Adam and Eve were cast out of God's sacred garden space when they became unclean. When I go back and read some of these descriptions about the Garden of Eden, I'm tempted to say, wow, the Garden of Eden looks a lot like the temple. You've got three spaces. You've got God's presence. And it does. The Garden of Eden looks a lot like the temple. But let's not get things backwards. The reality is the temple looks a lot like the Garden of Eden. And by the way, maybe we'll discuss this in a future lesson. If you take the time to really go read all of the descriptions about when the tabernacle was constructed and when the temple was constructed, go count up how many times they put trees inlaid in gold emblazoned on the walls or the curtains. Look at how many of the instruments that they use, the candlesticks, all this look like flowers blossoming. That's not by mistake. The tabernacle was meant to look like the garden. The temple was meant to look like the garden. Why? Why do they look alike? They look alike because both of them are sacred space. Space where heaven and earth meet, where God lives among and interacts with his creatures. But all of this leads me to make this point. My question was, who is the first priest? Who first filled that role for God, serving in sacred space, guarding sacred space, protecting what God entrusted to them to protect? Sacred spaces are cared for by priests. At Mount Sinai, it was Moses and Aaron who kept the people away from God's presence, who created this buffer, this mediation between Yahweh and the people of Israel. In the tabernacle and the temple, it was the descendants of Aaron and the Levites who created this buffer, who made sure that sacred space was maintained and holiness was maintained there. I think it's only right that we would expect to see this pattern at Eden as well. Who is serving that function in the Garden of Eden? Adam and Eve are the first priests in the whole Bible. They're the first people who ever served the priestly function. And it's true that Adam and Eve are never called priests. That word is never used to describe them. You may remember, of course, that Melchizedek is the first person in the Bible who has that title. But what becomes clear when you read through Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is that Adam and Eve function as priests in the Garden of Eden. Remember a couple of the functions of priests. Priests serve in sacred space. Priests protect sacred space. And priests mediate between God and humanity. They mediate, they represent God to the world. You remember what Adam and Eve's job description was in the Garden of Eden? Remember what they were told to do? Genesis chapter 2, verse 15 says, "Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it." Two things are mentioned there in chapter 2, verse 15 of Genesis. The New American Standard says to cultivate it and keep it. If you're reading from the English Standard Version, it'll say to work it and keep it. And a passing reading may sound like this is just mundane gardening tasks. Like God put them in there and he said, just do some gardening. Just make sure that the leaves are kept up. Make sure the grass is cut. That's sort of what it sounds like to us in a passing reading, perhaps. But these two words, cultivate and keep, work and keep, these two words are later used to describe the work of the Levites and the priests in relation to the tabernacle. Numbers chapter 3. One of those numbers. Numbers chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. If you read that, both of those descriptions, both of those words are used. There it's translated duties and service. That's what the Levites were to do. Their duties and their service in the tabernacle. Same words that describe what Adam and Eve did in the garden. Their duties and their service. Their work and their guarding of the tabernacle, of the sacred space of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were created to serve as a sort of priest in God's garden. They were meant to be stewards and guardians of the sacred space of Yahweh. But what exactly does that work look like? If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, and you look at when God first created Adam and Eve, this is what it says in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." The first thing I notice about that description of humanity is that humanity, Adam and Eve, were described as representatives of God to the rest of creation. We will make them in our image. They will look like us, and they will exert our rule and authority in the world around us. They're going to represent me, God says. They bore God's image, exerted his rule. They represented God, which, by the way, is exactly what the priests did. They represented God to the people around them. The second thing I notice about the things that God was telling them that they were to do in the Garden of Eden is that they were to multiply, they were to expand the domain of God's sacred space. And then the third thing I notice is that they were to subdue it, to rein it in, to control the sacred space, to guard it from intruders, to make sure that it remained pure and holy and consecrated and sacred to the service of God. Let me try to quickly summarize all this. I should have led with this, right? Just summarize it. Don't give us all that. Sacred space exists where God makes himself tangibly present with his people. And everywhere God's presence exists, there are priests who represent him and guard and protect his holy space. The very first sacred space in the world was the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were commissioned as caretakers of God's sacred space. I want to make two concluding observations that I hope will leave you with some glimmer of why this might be useful to know. I hope you found it interesting, but maybe there's a reason why we should be noticing these kinds of things. First is this: Adam and Eve are not just the first priests. They are the first priests, but they're not just the first priests. Adam and Eve are the prototypes of all future priests. Their role, their successes, their failures should help us understand the priesthood stories in the rest of the Bible. Priests should look like Adam and Eve in what they've done well and reject what Adam and Eve did when they've done wrong. And so I imagine as we look at further priests in the Bible, and we see how they measure up and how well they handle sacred space and what they do with the stewardship that God gives them to serve in his sacred space, I imagine that we'll be returning to Adam and Eve from time to time. But second, I think we need to start understanding this. We need to recognize that Adam and Eve, and by extension, all humanity, was originally intended to fill a priestly role. That's what God created you for, to be a priest. This is not the job of two random characters in the Bible. This is the job of humanity. God created you to bear his image, to represent him to people in the world around us. God created you to expand his rule and to guard what he has entrusted to you. You, like Adam and Eve before you, are supposed to be a priest. And by the way, that is where the story of the priesthood ultimately ends up when we get to the New Testament. We'll talk about this towards the end of the year. But Peter will say that we have become a royal priesthood, that we are priests in the temple of the Lord's body. And at the end of Revelation, we comprise the sacred space of the heavenly temple in the New Jerusalem. That's a fulfillment of what Adam and Eve were supposed to be. We're supposed to be priests like them. The priesthood theme is not abstract. It's our calling. It's what we're expected to be. And we learn that from the very first priests in the very first sacred space in the Bible. Are you representing God like a priest? Are you helping others come into his presence? The gospel demands that you conform your life to look more like God. And the way we do that, initially, is by being immersed into the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And if there's some way we can help you or encourage you with your spiritual walk, with your life with the Savior, then we want to have an opportunity to do just that. Why don't you come? Let us know what we can do as we stand and as we sing a song of encouragement.